Okay, so first, I will start with talking about adaptations to exercise in the heat. So the main changes to the blood include the expansion of plasma volume within the first 1 to 3 days. We'll talk about this in more detail on the next slides. And then the blood volume usually returns to the original levels within 10 days. So this is not like a long-term adaptation. And then the changes to sweating include that there is more sodium that's being reabsorbed. And this also causes the sweat to be more diluted. And there's an increase in sweating rate, especially in areas that are more exposed, for example, the arms and the legs. These are areas that are most effective at dissipating body heat. There's also an increased release of aldosterone and ADH, and also the sweat glands become more sensitive to the hormone aldosterone. And this also causes the sweat to be more diluted. And then sweating also begins earlier as the exercise begins. And then lastly, the blood flow change causes more even distribution of the sweat all over the body.
Awesome.
So the plasma volume changes by two mechanisms. The first mechanism is going to be the plasma proteins increase in the blood. So an increase in the total intravascular protein content during heat acclimation causes the movement of fluid from the interstitial to the intravascular space where protein remains supporting plasma expansion. And then the second mechanism is increased aldosterone and ADH. During exercise heat acclimation, there's an increase in total body water, which is caused by large amounts of aldosterone and ADH being secreted during exercise heat stress to restore the balance between the arteriolar and the venous tone. And then an increase in plasma volume increases the vascular filling pressure to support cardiovascular stability and increases the specific heat of blood, which improves heat transfer from the core to the skin, which allows lower cutaneous blood flow responses, resulting in a greater cardiac output and a higher VO2 at a given effort level.
Hi guys. So during sweating, there's an increased dependence on evaporations for a means of increased demand for the sweating. And so actually I thought it was interesting as well as for aldosterone. The sweat that forms during light sweating contains very little of electrolytes of sodium and potassium. With training and repeated heat exposure, acclimation allows for more sodium to be reabsorbed and the sweat is more dilute. Therefore, the sweat glands become more sensitive to the hormone aldosterone. The sweat glands do not use this mechanism for other electrolytes like potassium, calcium, and magnesium, like was mentioned in the TBL day. They're not reabsorbed by the sweat glands and are therefore found in similar concentrations in sweat and plasma. While performing heavy exercise in hot conditions, the body can lose up to a liter of sweat per hour. Side note, the electrolyte concentration of sweat is strongly influenced by genetics and the rate of sweating and acclimation, not acclimatization. Endurance training causes sweat glands to decrease electrolyte content of sweat secretion, like I mentioned. And then when sweat glands became more sensitive after heat acclimation, then we reduce our sweat sodium content. Okay, so and then for how do we sweat more, like the action and mechanism behind it is when the air temperature is close to skin temperature, the only available means of cooling is evaporation of sweat. The preoptic anterior area, it's like the PAAP of the hypothalamus is the primary thermoregulatory center. It acts as like a thermostat almost. It monitors the temperature and accelerates heat loss or heat production as needed. There's two sets of thermoreceptors that provide temperature. Like I said, the POAH, the peripheral receptors and the peripheral receptors in the skin. And they rely information on the temperature of the skin and the environment around it. There's increased sweat gland activity, which decreases the temperature by increasing evaporation, heat loss. Smooth muscle in the skin, arterioles, and I apologize for not being able to pronounce it, can cause these vessels to dilate to direct blood to the skin for heat transfer or to constrict to retain heat deep in the body. Metabolic heat production can also be stimulated by the actions of hormones such as thyroxine and catecholamines. And thyroxine is released by the thyroid. Side note. Okay, so how does skin blood increase. The sympathetic control of the skin blood flow is unique in that there are sympathetic vasoconstrictor fibers. The sympathetic active vasodilator fibers interacting over most of the skin surface area during dynamic exercise as body core temperature rises. There's initially a reduction in sympathetic vasoconstriction, and it causes a passive vasodilation, excuse me, once a specific body core temperature threshold is reached. And thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Great information. Very good. Okay, let me just, yeah, I can go back to sharing my screen here. Very good work, team. Oh yeah, actually, I don't want to share it from there. I want to share it from my iPad. Hold on one sec. Okay, yeah, so I just pretty much, Zita definitely said all of these things. I just wrote them down in this way to fill up the slide. So yeah, we got that increase in plasma volume, takes 1 to 3 days, perfect. Those are the 4 sweat changes, right? So more reabsorption of sodium, which makes more dilute sweat, like Zita said. More sweating in the arms and the legs. Sweating starts earlier, right? So those are the 4 sweat changes. And then, like she said, that increase in blood flow to the skin. So those are the 5. So perfectly done there, Zita. Next one, the 2 mechanisms were clearly stated. I just wanted to expand a little bit on kind of the order of events here with the plasma protein one. And so we definitely have more plasma proteins, which increases osmotic pressure in the blood. Okay, so that helps the blood hold on to more fluid. And then these two hormones cause the kidneys to hold on to more fluid in the body, right? So those 2 things happen. But the deal with the plasma proteins is when we exercise, we increase blood pressure, right? And when we exercise in the heat, it increases blood pressure even more. And so that increase in blood pressure, that's going to actually push, I'll just say PP plasma proteins out of capillaries. Okay, so with really high blood pressure and with that heat stress, we actually can lose some plasma proteins. They get pushed out of the blood and they end up in the interstitial space. Okay, so then that stimulates the liver to make more. Okay, more plasma proteins, right? So if the liver starts making more plasma proteins and puts those plasma proteins into the blood, now that kind of replenishes the ones that we lost. But then we also have this lymphatic system that's very efficient, and it brings those plasma proteins back. Okay, so we make more to replenish it, but then we also bring the lost plasma proteins back. So then the result is more plasma proteins. Okay, so just important to understand that chain of events too. So what stimulates the increase in plasma proteins? Well, it's the loss of plasma proteins into the interstitial space. Okay, and so the liver makes more, but then the liver made more, but then we also are able to recover those ones that were lost too. So we end up with more plasma proteins than we started with, and that's how we get more osmotic pressure than what we started with. Okay. All right, so that was one thing I just wanted to expand on a little bit. And any questions on any of those? Okay, and then with the sweat changes, the mechanisms here, this is really like a mechanisms slide, right? And so perfect on the sweat concentration one, that increase in aldosterone sensitivity is going to lead to more bringing back of sodium. The other thing that I don't think the book mentions on this, but it's just something that I add to this, is that what does that is actually little proteins that are lining the side of the sweat glands. Okay, so the sweat glands have like this big kind of like bulbous part to the bottom of them. That's kind of like the big coiled part. And then all of that goes into a little tube that connects to the skin, right? So in the all along the tube that connects to the skin, there's little proteins going all along that. And when the sweat is passing through that, those proteins actually pull the sodium back as it's passing through. So actually just get an increase in these sodium transport proteins. Okay, so we get more of those proteins and they also become more active too. So that's the second mechanism there that helps us bring more sodium back. Okay, so aldosterone is what stimulates those proteins to actually do their job and pull the sodium back. So we get more sensitive to that. And then we also just have more of those proteins available to do that job. Okay, with the how do we sweat more? Yeah, Michaela, you went into some great detail on all of that. The two big things that I want you to know for sure, though, are number one, since we have more fluid available because we got more plasma volume, we got more fluid in the body, that just enables us to sweat more. Okay, so that's number one. So that's kind of a simple one. And then number two, which also isn't in the book, which is extra information I'm giving you, is our sweat glands actually hypertrophy. Our sweat glands actually get bigger. Okay, so we get buff sweat glands when we train in the heat. Okay, and it's not the tube part that changes; it's that coiled part actually expands, and we actually just get more space for sweat in those sweat glands. And so that's really the number two big mechanism there. Okay, and then typically Michaela again went into some nice detail on the skin blood flow. Probably the one thing I'm really looking for there, which I think you said in there, Michaela, but I just wanted to sum it up, summarize it for everybody, would just be that we kind of have this increase in SNS sensitivity as well. Similar to how we had an increase in aldosterone sensitivity up here, we get an increase in this SNS, sympathetic nervous system activity sensitivity, because remember, that's what causes the vasodilation in the skin, is that sympathetic nervous system activity. So the skin blood vessels just become more responsive to the same amount of sympathetic nervous system activity, so we get more vasodilation. And then secondly, we get an increase in capillaries as well. Just like we could grow capillaries when we do endurance training around our muscle, we can grow more capillaries in the skin when we do training in the heat. Okay. All right. So that pretty much covers that. Any questions? Any clarification on any of those adaptations of the heat before we keep moving on? Okay. All right. So let's go here. So I think this was yeah. What slide number is this one? Oops, sorry. Yeah, this is 5. So slide 5. Yeah. So 5 and 6 I think was team 6, right? So I can go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and who's ever doing that can hop on there.
Okay, so for our team, we covered slides 5 and 6, which was just about changes of heart rate and overall core temperature during exercising in heat and how we acclimate to those. So for the first section of this presentation, we'll be going over the temperature of the graph itself and the exercise time versus the heart rate as well. So generally speaking, heat acclimation is the process by which repeated exercise exposure to heat stress improves one's ability to support cardiovascular function and loss of heat during subsequent bouts of exercise and heat stress. So in the graphs to the right, you'll see that the person that's acclimated to heat in blue have a decreased heart rate as well as a decreased rectal temperature versus those who are unacclimated to heat. We see that the reason of this mainly supports the sweating earlier, as well as the increased rate of sweating, especially in areas that are exposed to skin, as I believe Zita mentioned earlier. As we have greater exposure to skin, like at the legs and the arms, we'll increase sweating rates there and distribution of sweating across the body. And then this results in an overall temperature of the skin decreasing, as well as the thermal gradient from the skin to the environment changing as well, which promotes heat loss via radiation and evaporation. And then both the core temperature and heart rate during any given exercise and heat are reduced at any given time after you have acclimated to that specific environment. It does take, I believe, full changes was 10 to 14 days, because that's how long it takes for the sweating to occur, which is the later part. The whole blood part with plasma changing takes like 1 to 3 days. All right.
Yeah, so basically just to reiterate off of that, with what we see in the graphs, both heart rate and the rectal temperature for people who are heat acclimatized obviously is lower than people who are not heat acclimatized. And just kind of, we're going to go into this later, but the biggest points for heart rate off of the last slide, the changes in blood, our plasma volume increases. And this is seen within the first 3 days. And basically the main takeaway is that this increases stroke volume so that we're able to supply more oxygen to our muscle, basically less of an over expenditure than we need to. And then for our rectal temperature, just as Josh said, we're able to sweat earlier, but also just kind of keeping that relationship in check of how there is a relationship between heat capacity and heat acclimatization. So basically, heat capacity is enhanced by heat acclimation, as well as being able to sweat earlier. And then just lastly, as a sidebar, we need, in order for full heat acclimation to occur, we need to be in a hot environment. And that's in the first between 9 and 14 days. And that starts with the increase in plasma volume, and then kind of like cascades into that stroke volume, which then cascades into the sweat improvements.
And then a little bit more about the changes in the sweat and the blood with acclimation. Sweating is going to be starting earlier. It takes about 10 to 14 days to acclimate. The rate of sweat also increases. Sweat increases in the arms and legs, basically just like the places that promote heat loss more efficiently. And then sweat is more dilute, as we talked about earlier. It's due to the reabsorption of sodium, so less sodium is lost. And then in the blood, increases blood flow to the skin. Plasma volume also increases, which takes 1 to 3 days. Plasma proteins increase, and then the increased aldosterone and ADH.
So for the 4 methods of heat transfer, the 2 that we're mainly harping on here are going to be evaporation and radiation for sure. But just to give a general overlook, radiation's the loss of heat from the body surface to a cooler solid surface that's not in direct contact. So we'll see that with the environment of someone exercising in heat. Heat will be radiating off of them. Conduction is the loss of heat from the body surface to cooler surfaces in direct contact. We're not really in direct contact with like a specific thing in our environment when we're running, unless you're, I don't know, rowing or something that involves actually like gripping onto something. Convection, this is the flow of heat from the body surface to cooler air. And then evaporation is the loss of heat when a liquid is converted to a vapor, which we see as the main form of cooling in exercising in bouts of heat. And that's it. Thanks, guys.
Great job. Yeah, really good. Let me go ahead and share my screen again here. Very good. Yeah, that was all excellent. You guys covered it all. I don't think I have anything to add that you didn't say, but I'll just I'll just show my screen here in the way that I took the notes, in the way that I would want you to think about it. Just to kind of summarize, is those changes in the blood, obviously those are the plasma volume changes. They affect both the heart rate by this whole chain of events, which you guys fully explained, right? If we got more plasma volume, then we can still send blood to the skin, we can sweat some out and still have more left over for venous return, right? And that's the big thing. So we can maintain that venous return, which helps us maintain our end diastolic volume, which helps us maintain our preload, right? which helps maintain stroke volume, which is the key thing that allows for that heart rate to be lower every step of the way when we're heat acclimated. Right? So that's how the blood changes affect our heart rate, right? So, and then the blood changes also affect our sweating, because if we got more blood, then we got more we can send to the skin, right? So if we're sending more to the skin, then we can radiate out more heat with that. And that was what Josh was just saying with the radiation part. And then if we got more blood, we can also send more plasma volume into those sweat glands and be able to, and that enables us to have more sweat too, right? So the blood changes and the sweat changes are fully tied to each other, okay? And it is important to reiterate, both groups had the time here, but yeah, we see about 2 weeks for the sweat changes to occur, about 1 to 3 days for the blood changes to occur. So if you're giving advice to an athlete that's going to be exercising or performing competing in a really hot environment, and they're asking, how can I do this, right? Well, if they can get there 1 to 3 days ahead of time, great, you'll have some adaptations to that. If they can get there 1.5 weeks to 2 weeks ahead of time, even better, right? Then they'll have even stronger adaptations to that, okay? And so that's the blood changes one, the sweat changes. And like Josh has walked us through, I do want you to be able to kind of connect directly certain changes to some of those methods of heat transfer, right? So the sweating more, the sweating earlier, the sweat in the arms and the legs, all of that leads to more evaporation, right? And that's going to cool us down, obviously. Perfect, okay? Just like Josh just said, the sweat being more dilute, since we end up with holding on to some more sodium, that maintains our osmotic pressure in our blood a little bit, which does help us hold on to more fluid so we don't get quite as dehydrated, okay? So that's the sweat changes helping to cool us down. And then one thing that kind of connects to this, the sweat changes, if they're cooling us down, so if cooler, then decreased S&S activity, right? Then we maybe can decrease heart rate some because of this, right? So these sweat changes can be connected to the heart rate one as well, because we're just staying cooler, and so that's less stress on our bodies, and that's going to decrease our heart rate some, okay? But obviously, if we're sweating more, then we're losing more fluid, but hopefully we have more fluid to lose, and those things can kind of balance out, because losing fluid obviously affects us up here with the plasma volume, but hopefully we're able to do that and still have plenty of fluid left over, and still maintain our stroke volume. Okay, but I do want you to, just like the group did, and just like I tried to summarize for you here, I want you to connect both the plasma volume changes. So the plasma volume changes to both the lower temperature and the lower heart rate. And I want you to connect those sweat changes to the lower temperature, and specifically to the methods of heat transfer. Okay, and then also connecting those sweat changes to the heart rate one, like I just did there. Okay, great job, group number 6. Any questions on those? Okay, well, let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen here, and we will let group number 5 take us through the short-term effects of altitude. This will be like when you first arrive at altitude, what does your body go through? What stimulates these changes, and what changes do we see?
You can see the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So yeah, like you said, altitude, the short-term effects on altitude. First thing, the steps leading to transfer of oxygen to working muscles begins with pulmonary ventilation, which is the active movement of gas molecules into the alveoli of the lungs. And when exposed to high altitude within the first few seconds, ventilation increases because of the low PO2, which is sensed by the chemoreceptors in the aortic arch and carotid arteries. Low PO2 signals are sent to the brain to increase the breathing. As for there.
Sorry, I was on mute. An increase in ventilation is associated with increased tidal volume and respiratory rate. the amount of carbon dioxide in the alveoli is reduced to ventilation being increased at high altitudes. More carbon dioxide is diffused out of the blood and into the lungs to be exhaled. And this causes the blood partial pressure of carbon dioxide to fall and blood pH to increase.
So respiratory alkalosis has two effects, and the first one is it causes oxyhemoglobin saturation curve to shift to the left, and because of this shift, more oxygen binds to hemoglobin in the lungs and more oxygen is unloaded to the tissues at higher altitudes. And the second effect is it helps keep the rise in ventilation, which is caused by low PO2 from increasing more.
And then the plasma volume. So plasma volume initially decreases and it can decrease up to 25% because of water loss during respiration and water loss due to increased urine production. So the kidneys release EPO, which stimulates red blood cell production, and this increases the total number of red blood cells and contributes to greater blood volume, allowing partial compensation for the low PO2, which is caused by the altitude.
Great. Good job, guys. Yeah, very good. Okay. Yeah, let me go ahead and go back to sharing the screen there. And so this one does have a very important like chain of events, right? Like this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, right? So that's important to recognize that and know that. Okay, so here's my slide here, and this was all everything the team said. So I'm not adding anything to what the team said. I'm just putting it in the format of this slide so you guys can see how to fill out that slide. But yeah, pretty much the brain senses that low oxygen in the blood, right? And that and just like you guys said, that's picked up by different receptors throughout the body that are monitoring oxygen levels, right? And that's going to cause us to breathe more, right? So we increase our ventilation, okay? And like I said before, this is an example. Oops, this is an example of hyperventilation, right? Because the definition of hyperventilation is when we increase ventilation not in response to an increase in metabolism, right? Because we increase ventilation when our metabolism isn't actually higher, then we're not producing more CO2, so our CO2 levels will fall, right? And so that's really the bottom line here is CO2 levels fall because we're breathing more without making more CO2. Okay, so CO2 goes down, that increases pH as well, causes this leftward shift in the curve that we talked about last time with the quiz. And then just want to make sure to clarify this because you guys said, you did increase loading, but then you also mentioned there's more oxygen unloaded at the tissues, which just want to make sure that leftward shift directly causes more loading of oxygen at the lungs. Okay, and how would we see that? What would be a way to like measure that? How would that show up in some kind of a measurement? You guys know what I'm getting at? Anybody in that team? How would we like be able to measure the effects of that?
You can measure like the blood oxygen saturation.
Perfect. Absolutely. Yeah. So we'd actually see that. We'd see an increase in O2 saturation, right? So that's key there. And that goes right back to this, right? That goes right back to our stimulus for more ventilation, right? Because that was the stimulus, was low oxygen saturation. This directly helps with that initial problem or that initial thing that was stimulating this. We kind of correct for that a little bit here. So it's a way that the body actually corrects for the saturation a little bit. And one thing to recognize when we start looking at these altitude changes is they're not all good, right? So in all the other adaptations we've talked about before have all been good things, right? So all the adaptations to strength training all made us stronger, all the adaptations to endurance training made us faster or whatever. All the adaptations to heat were positive things too, right? But with altitude, it's not that way. So it's important to recognize that because there's a little bit of a switch in your brain there that needs to happen, that all the stuff we're talking about does not help you necessarily, okay? And the next one is the first example of that, right? Our plasma volume goes down. And this is just a product of breathing more. When we breathe more, every time we breathe, we lose some water. So we're breathing more, we're going to lose more water, okay? But then secondly, we have a extra loss of urine too. Yeah, and so those things all together cause that plasma volume decrease, okay? And then, and I don't know if yeah, I guess the next team will get into the effects on the cardiovascular system of that, because that was on the next slide. But then I think you guys said this one too. I was trying to write and didn't hear you say this last part, but I'm pretty sure you did. So the low partial pressure of oxygen sensed in the blood by the kidneys leads to EPO release, right? Erythropoietin release, which is going to start the process of increasing red blood cells. All right, so that starts our bone marrow to start making more red blood cells. But and I don't know if you guys said this or not, but that doesn't automatically increase red blood cells right then. Did you guys say the time frame on how long that takes? I wasn't sure. No. Okay. Yeah. So we wouldn't expect to see the effects of this for 2 to 3 months, actually. So it takes a long time to actually see those changes. Okay. It is short term. The stimulus for it is short term, right? We stimulate this to happen right away, but the effects of that change we don't actually see until a couple months down the road. Okay, and so these plasma volume changes, in a way, are good things, but then also in a way are bad things too. Okay, so yeah, so the way that it's a good thing is that if we decrease the water content of our blood, then we pretty much are increasing the oxygen carrying capacity of our blood. We're increasing our hematocrit, right? If we have blood and all of a sudden, and we have blood with mostly red blood cells and then water in between, if we take some of that water out, which is what this is doing here, then now every little drop of blood has more red blood cells in it, right? And so every time that blood goes through the capillaries, there's more oxygen in that blood. And so that's where the plasma volume changes are positive, right? So that increases O2 carrying capacity, okay? But it also is going to mess with our cardiovascular system in a second, right? And so it's eventually going to decrease our stroke volume a little bit, right? And that's where it becomes a problem. Okay, so there's kind of a good part of this, and you can see why the body would try to do this, right? Why it would make you urinate more. But then you can also see that it doesn't necessarily work out for us in the long run. Okay. Questions on any of that before we move on to the long-term effects? All right. Well, that is going to be team 4. So go ahead and take it away, team 4. You can start sharing your screen.
Okay, sharing it right now. Can you guys see it?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay, so we looked at the effects of altitude, short-term and long-term. So if you look over at the graph, it's really helpful to see. But so for stroke volume at rest, there's a decrease, which ultimately affects cardiac output, which we'll see in a second. With cardiac output plummeting, stroke volume decreases significantly with maximal exercise compared to at sea level. So if you look over at maximal exercise, there's a stroke volume graph, and you can see at sea level, it's pretty high, almost to 120 milliliters per beat. And then it really plummets like just a few days at altitude, and then it slowly increases, but it still is significantly less than at sea level for stroke volume. And then moving on to heart rate at rest, after a few days, heart rate is skyrocketed because the partial pressure of oxygen is less, so ventilation is greater. At maximal exercise, heart rate is less than at sea level because physiologically there is less oxygen in the lungs than can get to the muscles that need it. So you can see heart rate at rest at the top left, and then heart rate at maximal exercise, the top right. And so that rest, it skyrockets from like 60 to like almost 80, and then it slowly decreases. And then maximal exercise, it just decreases right off the bat. So yeah, and then Karina is going to go into cardiac output. Karina.
Yeah, sorry, my internet was slow. At rest after a few days, heart rate is skyrocketed because the partial pressure of oxygen is less. Oh, sorry, I'm doing cardiac output. At rest, cardiac output increases sympathetic nervous system, and the release of norepinephrine and epinephrine is active for the first 2 days of altitude exposure. At submaximal exercise, cardiac output increases. However, after a few days, the muscles start to extract more oxygen from the blood, reducing the demand for increased cardiac output. At maximal exercise, though, cardiac output plummets due to less venous return and lower plasma volume.
Hi, I'm going to do the next slide, which is long-term changes at altitude. So first, the hemoglobin after about 2 weeks at altitude, erythrocyte circulation increases, and the lack of oxygen at altitude will stimulate the release of EPO. So the EPO concentration increases 3 hours after arriving at altitude, and it continues to increase 2 to 3 days after that. And then the EPO concentration reaches baseline after about 3 months at altitude. After 6 months at altitude, blood volume increases about 10%, which is due to erythrocyte production and plasma volume expansion. And the blood hemoglobin increases proportionally with increases in elevation where people may live. And that would be caused as erythrocytes increase, and so would the hemoglobin content. For stroke volume, at maximal exercise, stroke volume from sea level to altitude, it decreases from 2 to 3 days, but then after that, stroke volume increases gradually from 2 to 3 days to weeks and then to months. Heart rate at rest, heart rate increases dramatically during the first 2 to 3 days, then declines slightly after weeks and months. Even though heart rate declines slightly after months at altitude, it's still higher than at sea level. And then during maximal exercise, heart rate decreases significantly from sea level for the first 2 to 3 days, and then it gradually decreases from days to weeks to months. For cardiac output, altitude reduces total blood volume, which reduces submaximal and maximal cardiac output acutely. As the body acclimates, there is an increase in plasma volume and red blood cells, which leads to an increase in maximal cardiac output.
So this is the long-term changes in response to altitude continued. All right, so muscle cell tissues undergo both structural and metabolic changes in response to exercise in the high altitude. So structurally, after about 4 to 6 weeks in the hypoxic environment, there is a noticeable decrease in the muscle area, and the loss in muscle mass can be accounted for the loss of appetite from the high altitudes. Next is the capillary supply to the muscle. There is an increase in the capillary density in the muscles, and this leads to an increase in blood and oxygen delivery to the muscle fibers. And this can also be accounted for a response to the lack of O2 at the higher altitudes. This also increases the capillary to muscle fiber ratio. And metabolically, after about 4 weeks, the mitochondrial function and glycolytic enzyme function begins to decrease. The mitochondria activity, there's a decrease in the mitochondrial density, which suggests that the muscle loses their ability to perform oxidative phosphorylation, which means that there is a decrease in the overall ATP production.
All right, excellent, excellent job. Very good. Let me hop back on and wrap us up here. Very good. All the teams have been awesome today. Great, great job. Great work putting in some work, creating slides, and I appreciate it. Looks really good. Okay, this just pretty much just fills in the slide, but the team gave us more detail than all of that. So the short-term effects, we just talked about short-term on the previous page where they lost plasma volume, right? They lost all that plasma volume. And then the result of that is a decrease in stroke volume, right, due to lost plasma volume. And again, that was because they were breathing more and because they were urinating more, right? And so in response to that, our heart rate jumps up, and it jumps up drastically, like Sophie said. Okay, we get a big increase in heart rate. And so then the interesting part about this is just those first few days at altitude, our cardiac output actually is a little bit higher at rest, a little bit higher submaximally, because the heart rate increase is actually greater than the stroke volume decrease, right? That makes sense, right? Because cardiac output's heart rate times stroke volume. So we get this kind of, decrease in stroke volume, but an excessive increase in heart rate that actually bumps up our cardiac output a little bit. So it's trying to kind of overcompensate for that. But even at that point, maximal exercise isn't able to be maintained. So we still can't achieve a full maximal cardiac output, right? So that was all stuff that the team said. So great work on that. And then the long-term stuff, very good explaining that, Marissa. You gave much more detail than I did on the kind of dynamics of red blood cells and how those change. And like Marissa said, even within 2 weeks, we can start seeing a few more red blood cells. Okay, I had said before 2 to 3 months till we see the full effect of that, which is still true. But it was important that you said that, Marissa, that in 2 weeks we actually start seeing some more red blood cells. So it's not like it takes 2 months to see anything. It's just that it probably takes about 3 months, like you said, for EPO to normalize again, which that means that our red blood cells are up to where they need to be again, right? So it takes 3 months to get the full effect. But we do start seeing it within a couple of weeks. So that was really good. And then the good point about within 6 months, we see like a 10% increase in blood volume, some of that being red blood cells, but also some of that being plasma volume. But still, even with that increase of 10%, our stroke volume is still going to be lower. Our heart rate is still going to be higher. Okay, it balances out a little bit, right? But overall, we still cannot, we don't have the same maximal cardiac output at altitude, even after we've become adapted to altitude. Okay, I want to make sure that's clear, because the way the book talks about it and the way you guys just explained it was totally right, but it almost sounds like cardiac output goes back up, like it goes back up to normal, but it doesn't go back up to normal. It goes back up from the initial low point, but it doesn't get back up to normal. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why exercise capacity is lower at altitude, for sure. Good question, Alex. Why are we eating less? It's just because one of the main symptoms of altitude, or one of the main symptoms of being at altitude is a bit of nausea and just a bit of discomfort in your stomach, and your appetite just drops. And so like Kyle explained well there, we're going to decrease our mitochondrial activity, and the main stimulus for that is just because we can't push ourselves as hard anymore. If we can't push ourselves as hard, then our mitochondria are going to get smaller, right? Capillary supply to muscle, that's one that's trying to help us, right? So we get more capillaries because there is less oxygen in the blood, so it's trying to help us out a little bit. Okay, it's a positive thing, but then our muscles atrophy too, right? Just like Kyle said. Okay, so we got some things that are bad here, right? Definitely atrophy is bad, that one's bad, that one's bad, this one's good, right? So you kind of have to weed through these and figure out which of these are actually helpful and trying to help us with altitude, and which of these are just kind of negative consequences of altitude, right? So it's important to work through those in your head to figure out which ones of these are actually helping us adapt to altitude, and which ones of these are just things that are making it harder for us to exercise at altitude. Okay, but fantastic work, teams, on everything today. And and then next time we'll jump into, we already did that one. So the next time we'll jump into all the kind of a review of these adaptations to endurance training, starting out here with this one, looking at submaximal first. So this slide is just kind of what are the changes. Then this slide is explain how each of these things change submaximal, and then we do maximal, and then we'll do the lactate stuff. And that'll pretty much be what we do next time. Okay. All right, guys. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you on Wednesday.
Thanks, Dr.